We're back on Steele and Vance. We are in the downtown Vancouver studios of our program and dreaming of a day, Linda Steele, that we can travel to far-flung areas. You've booked a flight.
I've booked a flight to Hawaii in February. And I did actually, because there's been so much concern about lost luggage, canceled flights, and all the rest of it, I got something from Amazon. It's actually some of those Apple Air tags. They look like this. I'm going to pop them into my luggage, and hopefully, if it doesn't get to where I'm going, I'll be able to at least track where it is.
You'll know where it is.
Because WestJet had a nightmarish scenario in the past week. They had kind of a computer meltdown, things overheated, reservations were nutty, and there were thousands of people who suddenly found out their flights were canceled.
Stuck everywhere. I had a friend of mine who said, I just heard from my wife, and this was on Saturday. She's in Mexico, and they're telling her to prepare herself for Tuesday departure. Tuesday.
Yeah. There's too much of this, and we're moving into the holiday travel season, and I know a lot of you are saying, what are my rights anyway? If the airline cancels a flight and it wasn't my fault, and what about my lost luggage, and how do you minimize the chances?
What are the tips? What are the
that
tricks?
Things are going to go wrong. Our next guest is going to help us with this, because Duncan D was the former Chief Operating Officer of Air Canada, and he is joining us now to give us some insight. Duncan, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
First and foremost, let's talk about what happened with WestJet. How did you consume that news? What did you see happening there?
Look, as soon as I heard that news, I just wanted to crawl under the covers because it was just one of those things that anyone who's ever been involved in an airline operation would be completely stressed out by. That, fortunately, I think for Canadians, for Canadian travelers, this is not something that happens regularly. Right. It's not something that we can predict, but it's also not something that has affected Canadian travelers very often. Unfortunately for WestJet, they were affected not because of their own fault. Back in July, you may recall that they had another outage on the Western Canadian air navigation system, which had a severe impact on WestJet, especially their Calgary hub operations. So, they've had a pretty rough go in terms of the computer system. So, a little bit more Control-Alt-Delete, let's say, in terms of what they've had to go through in terms of IT systems over at WestJet.
So, Duncan, let me ask you this, though. In the case of WestJet, this was a computer failure. It wasn't the air passenger's fault. What are your rights as a traveler? Is the airline then forced to book you a flight on a competitor's airline?
So that's a great question, and really the issue of fault is critical in terms of the Canadian air passenger regulations. If it's the airline's fault, which in this case obviously it was, passengers are entitled to certain types of compensation depending on the length of delay. So the Canadian regulations specify that delays that are 3 hours long, 6 hours long, or 9 hours long result in certain levels of compensation and also certain actions by the airlines. So if your travel was impacted where you were arriving longer than 9 hours later than your original scheduled arrival, you're entitled to, from a regulatory perspective, to be booked on any airline that gets you to your destination as quickly as possible, as close as possible to that 9-hour window.
Wow.
And within 48 hours. So that's something that the rules very specifically spell out.
And most travelers wouldn't even know that, right? Like that's a big aha moment, and why we wanted to have you on here. It's so important that we get the perspective from an expert, Duncan, and you certainly are that. And you also have some travel tips for us to protect ourselves as travelers. What should we make sure? What are like the top 3 things that we might be able to do to protect our holiday or travel beyond in this sort of tumultuous time for travelers, for sure?
And let's start with which seat you pick.
Right.
Well, in terms of travelers, just, when they're making their booking, they shouldn't wait till they get to the airport to pay for the seat fee or hope that they'll get a free seat. If they're able to select a free seat or even pay a little bit for that seat at the time of booking, I think that's critical in protecting travelers from that awful scenario where they could be denied boarding because of a flight oversale. This is not just for travelers who are traveling within Canada, but travelers going anywhere. make sure you give yourself that extra assurance of having a pre-selected seat when you make your reservation, even when it's going to cost you a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Always select your seat. And tip 2 we have here, what's a flight tracker?
So, these days information is gold, I mean, and that is as valid for travel as it is for anything else. And don't just rely on the information provided to you by the airline websites. There are now flight trackers that provide information live. And the source of that information is the air traffic control systems around the world. So if you are traveling, let's say from Victoria to Vancouver, and you're able to use the flight tracker to see that the aircraft that is operating your flight is coming in 15 minutes late or 20 minutes late, and that would result in a 20-minute delay to your departing flight, which would mean that your flight connecting time in Vancouver to somewhere else is going to be shorter, then having that information is critical, because you could then approach the airline and say, look, it doesn't look like I'll make my connection. And you may save yourself having to line up in Vancouver at the lineup where people have misconnected.
And very quickly, this one breaks my heart. You say don't check your bag.
Yeah, look, I mean, especially now that we're talking about Christmas travel, people are traveling with gifts, things that are important to them. Don't check your bags, especially during peak travel periods, just because it's just one added layer of complication and a part that you don't control in terms of your travel.
Duncan D, thank you so much for coming on, because this is information we all need to know as air travelers. We really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Duncan D is the former COO of Air Canada.
Aren't you relieved that you're not traveling until February and it's not holiday time and you can still pack your full bag?
I'm still packing a bag. I'm
Of
still
course
packing
she
a
is.
bag.
Slim to steal.
Still head on steal advance from a nail biter in the U.S. midterms. We still don't know the results to a failed bid to increase healthcare transfers in Canada. We're going to talk all things politics.
All of
coming
it.
up next.
The whole shebang.